Christ himself is the hope of the world. Christianity is a worldview of hope. Jesus Christ is the center of our faith, and Jesus promised the ultimate renewal of all things. And all of this was accomplished because Jesus died, and he was buried, and he rose again with power over death. This hope is as certain as the sun in the sky or as the air in my lungs. My hope does not change from election cycle to election cycle because the hope is anchored in something transcendent and eternal. Jesus Christ is King, and he has all authority. So we should pray and vote that God will be merciful to us and work through a deeply flawed man to sustain conditions of freedom long enough for us to, Lord willing, repent and turn to him. Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. My name is Michael Clary. I am a pastor in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am a husband and a father of 4. I am not a political analyst, but I did want to offer some pastoral counsel for people to discern how best to honor Christ with their vote this election season. So what I'm about to share with you is my sober-minded assessment of what's at stake and how I plan to steward my vote, and I pray this is helpful to you. Every election year, everyone says, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And that's true, and it will continue to be true for the foreseeable future. As the left gets more radical, the stakes get higher. Why is this? It's because our elections have become proxy wars between irreconcilable worldviews. These worldviews cannot simply coexist. They are truly irreconcilable, and the chasm widens as the left grows increasingly unhinged and radical. This pattern will not stop until a clear victor emerges with a mandate to govern. Pastor James White recently posted this on X. He said, quote, "We are literally in the last days of the American experiment with a constitutional republic. We are facing the election of full-blown, out-of-the-closet, ready-to-throw-you-in jail tomorrow Marxists." He goes on to say, "No, I don't like Trump. I don't like where he is going. I think his worldview is decrepit. But Harris Waltz is absolutely nothing less than voting for Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist Party and the swift and violent end of the United States. It's that stark a choice." That's just one example of many prominent Christian and secular leaders who have come to similar conclusions. I agree with them. 1 Peter 2, verses 13 and 14 says, "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." Peter tells us in this text the 2 basic duties of governments and rulers. They are, 1, they must uphold the good, and 2, they must punish evil. In Romans 13, Paul says that all governments have been instituted by God and are under his authority. In America, we do not have emperors or kings. We are self-governed through a democratic process. We choose our leaders and they are accountable to us. So you are not electing a king to rule over you. You are electing leaders to represent you. This November 5th, we will elect a president whose basic job duty under God's authority is to promote the good and to punish evil. That doesn't mean we are electing a pastor-in-chief who will lead us in prayer from the Oval Office. We are electing a president who will promote the conditions of freedom that allows good people to do good things and will punish bad people for doing bad things. Psalm 97 verse 10 says, "O you who love the Lord, hate evil." Proverbs 8 verse 13 says, "The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil." This is always an underlying principle in every election, but in this election, it's all the more clear. This election is about stopping the high-handed wickedness that is threatening the potential for goodness and virtue to thrive in our society. That great evil is represented by Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and the Democrat Party. Therefore, I plan to vote for Donald Trump on November 5th. Now, let me tell you how I arrived at this conclusion by sharing the following 5 points. Number 1, Donald Trump is a better candidate than we've been told. Now, this doesn't mean Christians should overlook or whitewash Trump's flaws. In John 7:24, Jesus said, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." So we should honestly and fairly assess the candidates, their parties, and the party platforms to see which better aligns with our values. So let me begin by addressing Trump's flaws. Trump is not a conservative about social issues. Regarding abortion, he's not fully pro-life, and that's very frustrating. Nevertheless, he's the only candidate that will even listen to us, and that's what we've got to work with. Regarding the LGBTQ revolution, Trump is a progressive in slow motion. He is okay with the milder versions of the sexual revolution and would only oppose the most extreme elements. This might help him get elected, but LGBTQ activists are always normalizing the extreme, so the Republican Party will be pulled to the left on LGBTQ issues. Here's the unpleasant fact. There hasn't been a true social conservative on the Republican ticket for a very long time. Not McCain, not Romney, not Bush, not the other Bush, not even Ronald Reagan. Changes in our culture have made social conservatism less of a priority for Republican candidates. For me, social issues are a big liability for Trump. And for these reasons alone, I can understand why Christians would, in good conscience, choose to not vote for him. That's what I did in 2016, though I did vote for him in 2020. Trump is not a man of high moral character. He's been married 3 times. He's had multiple affairs, not to mention other accusations that have not been proven. He can be petty and immature. His ego is legend. He's crude and insulting toward his political opponents. Some complain that he's unpredictable and disruptive, but in my view, that's not a liability, that's an asset. I don't want a president to manage our nation's decline. I want a president to disrupt the corrupt political establishment that's driving the decline. And how many election cycles have come and gone with politicians promising to drain the swamp? That's great campaign rhetoric, but it's never happened before because the swamp doesn't want to be drained. The snakes in the swamp are powerful, wealthy, and they've made themselves fat and rich off of taxpayer dollars. They don't want to give up their power. They will do whatever they can to eliminate the threat. Now, some may say, well, Trump is a convicted felon. In my opinion, this is not a serious objection because Trump was clearly targeted by his political opponents in a naked attempt to eliminate a rival. The charges were unprecedented, the judge was a known Democrat operative, and the trial was a career builder for ambitious people trying to make a name for themselves by prosecuting Trump. His convictions reveal more about the lengths Democrats will go to maintain power than anything it reveals about Trump. You'd have to believe that our justice system is free of political influence or corruption for the objection to be persuasive. This conviction exposes the corruption of the system rather than the guilt of the accused. You might also say, well, Donald Trump led an insurrection on January 6th. My response is this: no, he didn't. January 6th was not an insurrection attempt. Trump himself called for civility and peace that day. January 6th was a media narrative created by political opponents of Donald Trump so they could hang it around his neck to ensure that he would never seek public office again. Anyone who still thinks January 6th was a true insurrection has been watching too much MSNBC. Seriously, what sort of insurrection is led by mostly unarmed, middle-aged people? They weren't trying to take down our government, they were trying to restore it. They were carrying American flags and copies of the Constitution in their pockets. Yes, they were angry, but with good reason. 2020 was a huge eye-opener for a lot of people. COVID had people locked up for months. Churches were shut down. People in other countries were being arrested simply for going to church, and it was starting to happen here too. Parents noticed for the first time that their kids were being taught sexual perversion and critical race theory in schools because they were home doing online learning. And COVID prompted unprecedented changes to our election system that undermined its integrity. People had every right to be upset and to protest. Now, some people did get out of hand and cross the line, but the only person who died was Ashley Babbitt, who was an unarmed woman killed by the police. And all of this happened after we just spent the summer watching American cities set ablaze by BLM activists without consequence. And anyone who questioned the official narratives favorable to the left had their social media and YouTube accounts demonetized, locked, or deleted entirely. So, despite Trump's obvious flaws, he's a much better candidate for the office of president than we've been told. The apocalyptic warnings of what Trump might do did not come true in his first term as president. And for the past 9 years, his deficiencies have been constantly in the unforgiving spotlight of media scrutiny, while Kamala Harris's flaws have been thrown down the memory hole. Trump has overcome a massive media operation that was committed to tearing him down. And Trump's rare strength and courage were on display mere seconds after his ear was grazed by an assassin's bullet. Many of the accusations against Trump have been found to be exaggerations or outright fabrications. He's been vindicated time and time again. Although Christians should not overlook his serious flaws, we also can't blindly accept the media narrative about him. He's not the moral monster the media has portrayed him to be. I'll talk more about Trump's positive characteristics at the end of this video. But next, let's take a look at Kamala Harris. Number 2, Kamala Harris is a worse candidate than we've been told, and she's been protected by a compliant news media. The fact is this: she is not a woman of high moral character. She got her start in politics through an adulterous affair with Willie Brown, who was a married man and San Francisco mayor. And she represents the most radical and extreme wing of the leftist movement. Regarding abortion, she made this her number 1 campaign issue. Her running mate Tim Walz repealed a law in Minnesota that promised medical care for infants that survived botched abortions, which allowed those babies to be born alive and then die without trying to save them. This is utterly barbaric and extreme. Regarding the LGBTQ revolution, Kamala Harris is fully on board. During a Pride Month event a couple of years ago, the Biden administration allowed people to frolic around half naked on the White House lawn, and then the White House itself was lit up with the colors of the Pride flag at nighttime. Last year, the White House published a statement celebrating the Trans Day of Visibility, which happened to also fall on Easter. When questioned about whether or not so-called transgender people in prison should receive state-funded sex change operations, Kamala Harris responded by saying, "We should have that discussion." These are just a few of the numerous and well-documented instances of the Harris regime's extreme positions on sexual immorality. Regarding immigration, President Biden tasked Kamala Harris with securing the southern border, only for the border to become exponentially more porous. There are widespread reports of people from other countries being illegally flown into our country, given government money and overwhelming the social services of the communities where they are placed. Some of these people are known criminals, including murderers and rapists. For example, Laken Riley was a 22-year-old nursing student who went out for a jog, but she was bludgeoned to death by an illegal immigrant. The only explanation for why these things continue to happen is either that Kamala Harris is hopelessly incompetent at securing the border, or she wants the border to be open. And if that's the case, which I think it is, then she is using her position of power to inflict harm on the very people that she's charged with protecting. That's evil. Kamala Harris is incompetent on vital issues related to our survival as a nation. Regarding the economy, at present, 75% of our current GDP goes to payments on the national debt. This is insane. And she says nothing about addressing this in her public statements, other than to promise finding new ways to tax people's hard-earned dollars. She hasn't promised anything that would bring down inflation either. She even proposed a tax on unrealized gains, which is a way of taxing earnings that people haven't even earned yet, which invited sharp criticism even from her supporters. Regarding foreign policy, our enemies abroad do not respect or fear her. They see her as a naive, weak woman that they can manipulate and take advantage of. Kamala Harris rarely speaks to the press. She only does softball interviews that do not ask tough questions. And when she does interviews, it's often in highly choreographed and scripted environments. For example, in a recent interview with Oprah Winfrey, which was filmed in front of a live studio audience, one audience member took a cell phone video from an angle that showed that she was answering questions using a teleprompter. Now, there are some questions that I've never heard an answer to that are very important. For example, who's president right now? What did she know about Joe Biden's mental decline? And if she knew about it, why didn't she disclose it? And if Joe Biden was too incapacitated to run for re-election, then how can he be competent now to function as president? Kamala Harris cannot speak or articulate ideas of her own, which makes you wonder, does she have any? Or is she merely a puppet that is controlled by somebody that we don't know about? Kamala Harris doesn't have any accomplishments. Seriously, what has she accomplished? Not much. Joe Biden picked her as his running mate for vice president for one reason, and that is he had promised to nominate a woman of color. That's her only qualification. She had already dropped out of the 2020 race before the primaries even began, so she has not won a single primary delegate. Kamala Harris's biggest electoral asset for the left is her hatred for Donald Trump. Hatred for Trump animates her whole campaign. But hatred for Trump is not a vision for our future. She has the diversity points as a woman of color, but being a woman of color won't bring down inflation, fix our economy, secure our border, or protect our nation. In other words, she's fake. She's a chameleon. She will say anything to get elected. And since she's the Democrat nominee, she's the head of the Democrat Party, which is a powerful machine to promote evil. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Democrat Party machine. Number 3, the Democrat Party is evil. They are the party of radical secularists. There is only one mention of God in the published Democrat Party platform, and they are opposed to any form of traditional Christianity. They are the anti-family party. There is not a single pro-life Democrat in national politics, and they will tolerate no opposition to abortion, which is their chief sacrament. At the DNC convention earlier this year, there were mobile units outside the convention center offering free abortions and vasectomies. They are the anti-free speech party. Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and Barack Obama have all called for a Brazil-style censorship of free speech. And recent comments by John Kerry and Hillary Clinton are chilling. They've gone on record calling for suppression of what they call misinformation. But who gets to define what that is? They do, of course. Mark Zuckerberg confessed earlier this year to manipulating the 2020 election by suppressing stories about Hunter Biden's laptop, and he called those misinformation. But those reports were later found out to be true. Hillary Clinton recently said if social media companies don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose control. That was a very revealing statement, as though our speech should be under her control. That's why we call it free speech. There's a reason why freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. It's that important. This is how our system works. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said that any government that can silence its critics has the license to commit any atrocity. They are the party of arrogance and envy. The left views the American people as an ATM from whom they can extract wealth. They know if they tell you what they are actually doing, you'd never vote for it. So they create unsolvable problems and make unkeepable promises to fix them, but you have to keep voting for them to do so. And you're supposed to trust that they're doing it for a good purpose because they use the right buzzwords like compassion and tolerance and equity. So they take your money, and in exchange, they promise peace, food, security, entertainment, and a more social justice-y society. They give us stimulus checks, but then demand gratitude for giving us back our own money. They use labels like democracy and freedom to describe taking away our freedoms. For every dollar they take, they spend a small fraction on the problem they're supposed to be fixing, and the rest of it goes to funding their pet projects, enriching themselves and their friends, and solidifying their own power. Those who vote for it are either too blind to see or too heartless to care that this sort of action has devastating consequences. Democrats follow the iron law of projection. One of the most effective lies is to accuse your opponents of what you are doing. When your opponent notices that you were the one who is actually guilty, it confuses other people looking in into thinking both of them are guilty or both of them are lying. But that's not always true. This is textbook gaslighting, and the left uses this tactic masterfully. Here are some examples. Democrats claim to be the party of love, but clearly they are filled with hate and disdain for conservatives. They claim to be the party of racial justice, but all the literature acknowledges that the most racist people in our country are white liberals. They claim to be the party of unity, but they never miss an opportunity to stoke the fires of division through entitlement, resentment, and envy. They accuse Trump of using hateful rhetoric, while they constantly use violent rhetoric, comparing him to Hitler and the Nazis on the regular, calling him a threat to democracy. They claim they are trying to save our democracy while they carried out a palace coup in broad daylight, deposing a sitting president against his will and installing a nominee who actually had never had anyone vote for her. They claim to be saving our democracy while refusing to support voter ID legislation that would promote election integrity. They claim to be saving our democracy, though they blocked Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy when he was running as a Democrat, which forced him to run as an independent and gather millions of signatures to get on the ballots in every state, which he did. And then when he withdrew his candidacy, they sued to keep him on those ballots in swing states when they thought that it would benefit them. They claim a Trump presidency will push us closer to the brink of World War III, when actually Trump's first term was relatively peaceful, and we've gotten involved in 2 new conflicts in Israel and Ukraine under the Biden-Harris regime. They say a Trump presidency will lead to civil unrest, when he's the one that is being literally targeted for 2 assassination attempts by apparent Kamala Harris supporters. They claim to be the people of peace and love, while gleefully supporting rioters in 2020 who were looting and burning American cities while they were calling to defund the police. They say we need to elect Kamala Harris to fix these problems in our country, as though she and Joe Biden haven't been in power the last 4 years. All of these things are ripped out of the social activist Bible, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And one of these rules is to keep pressing your negative and unpopular ideas until eventually they break through the other side and people perceive them as positive. This works because you wear people down and brainwash them until they start accepting your irrational and foolish ideas as some sort of counterintuitive wisdom. They are the party that hates us. Right now, the biggest enemy of the American people is not the Islamic terrorists, or Russians with nukes, or the Chinese. The biggest enemy of the American people is the left. They hate us, and it's obvious. But it's not just the Democrat Party. It's the Republicans, too. Let me explain this in my 4th point. Number 4, the political establishment in Washington, D.C. is evil. Now, you might think, well, it's not just the Democrats that do all these things. Both parties do this. And actually, on this point, I agree with you. I'm glad you brought that up. Most Americans believe we have a 2-party system which provides checks and balances. But what if I told you that both parties are controlled by uber-rich mega-donors through campaign donations? What if I told you that the ruling class has rigged the system to ensure no one can truly oppose them? That is the way Washington, D.C. operates. The ruling class does not want what's best for our country. They want to placate us enough to keep us from becoming any sort of threat. They control both political parties, the news media, the markets. They control our currency. They control businesses through back-channel deals and corporate tax benefits. Have you ever wondered why Congress keeps passing legislation that is universally unpopular? Why is that? It's because most of these politicians don't care about their constituents. Even good politicians often end up betraying their constituents once they get into D.C. When they get to D.C., they are told, here's how things work in this town, and you have to play the game. Quite often, they lose their independence and get absorbed into the system like the Borg. You might think, well, this is all a conspiracy theory. No, it isn't. Don't you think it's odd that Dick Cheney, Mitt Romney, and all the Bush family are supporting someone as radical as Kamala Harris? And don't you find it odd that Elon Musk, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Tulsi Gabbard, who are former Democrats, have now started to support Donald Trump? There is a reason for this. Kamala Harris is supported by the corrupt regime of Cheney, Romney, and Bush. That's the uniparty system. This election is not about Democrats versus Republicans. That's the illusion I've been under for most of my life. But now the system that runs our country is being exposed for what it is. Have you seen the avalanche of reports of deep corruption in the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Secret Service? We still don't know what's happened with Trump's first assassination attempt. No one has been fired. So this election is not about Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. This election is about Donald Trump versus the entire corrupt establishment machine in Washington, D.C. From a spiritual perspective, I can't say this for certain, but perhaps in God's strange providence, God raised up a billionaire who didn't need money from mega donors, who had such a gargantuan ego that he'd be willing to take on the whole system by himself. I don't know if that's God's purpose, but it looks that way to me. We'll see. Either way, doesn't that help explain the political realignment we're seeing these days? The bloodthirsty warmongers that used to populate the Republican Party are now lining up behind Kamala Harris because she will keep the war machine humming and the money flowing into the military-industrial complex, just like Bush, Cheney, Obama, and Biden did. The more reasonable Democrats that used to have a place in the party 30 years ago are now so disillusioned with their party that they'll line up behind Trump to stop it. And that's not because they all suddenly became conservative and agree with him. Trump himself is not a real conservative. They're doing it because people like Elon Musk and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are high enough up in society and they have enough access to the levers of power to see what's really going on, and they're tough-minded enough to help him fight back against that system. Now, there is one thing that I am sure of. This is a spiritual war. I don't know the Lord's will in this election, but I do know that human rulers and governments function as proxies for a spiritual war in the unseen realm. Ephesians 6:10 says this, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." The scriptures bear witness that the material realm and the spiritual realm work in tandem, with actions in both realms bearing consequences for the other. No, I don't think that Donald Trump is some kind of divinely appointed savior. He's just a man, and he's not even a man of God. But we do see in Scripture that God does raise up rulers of all sorts to accomplish his purposes, and our duty as Christians is to fight for justice and righteousness as best we can. And that leads me to my fifth and final point. You've got 4 choices. Choose wisely. So, as Christians, how should we approach this election? I wouldn't presume to bind anyone's conscience about this, but I'll share what I think is a sober-minded approach. Here are the 4 options. I'll walk you through them briefly in order of worst to best. So first is the worst option, and that is to vote for Kamala Harris. This is simply not an acceptable option. A Christian cannot, in good conscience, support Kamala Harris for president. A vote for Harris is not a vote for decency or civility. Harris would no doubt use her political power to punish her enemies, especially Christians, suppress free speech by labeling anything she disagrees with hate speech or misinformation, continue to allow open borders as a thinly veiled future Democrats' voter drive, and continue to support the advance of the radical LGBTQ agenda in every level of society, and continue to advance the Holocaust of mothers murdering their own children in the womb. Simply put, it would be wrong for any Christian to vote for Kamala Harris. Number 2, abstain from voting. In my view, this is not an acceptable choice for Christians. To abstain from voting is choosing to be passive, uninvolved, and surrender your voice to someone else. That's not a faithful Christian option. Christians have a voice, and we need to make it heard. In other words, don't be a Valentine voter. Jesus isn't on the ballot. You're not voting for your next pastor, you're voting for your next president. And the president we need in these times is someone who will fight for us. Don't overly moralize your vote. Vote for who you think would do a better job running our country of the options that are available. You know, I recently saw that approximately 30 million Bible-believing Christians did not vote in the last presidential election. That's 30 million people. And did you know that the last election was decided by about 42,000 votes? Christians, use your voice and vote. The third option is vote third party. This is only slightly better than abstaining, but it has the same practical consequence. No third-party candidate is going to be the next president. In my view, this is acceptable as a choice for Christians given Trump's compromises on social issues, but I don't think it's wise. If both candidates were equally bad, then maybe you could make a case for this. But as I've already demonstrated, Harris is much worse than Donald Trump. Joe Rigney recently posted this. He said, "One political party is committed to high-handed rebellion against nature and nature's God in the form of abortion on demand, the destruction of the natural family, contempt for law and order, and the weaponization of the legal system. On the other hand, for all of its flaws, the other political party retains some grounding in the objective moral order that God has embedded in creation. As a result, you make the decision to support the second party as a vehicle for resisting high-handed wickedness and pursuing justice in civil society. And your reasoning is this: because you love God supremely, you seek to love your neighbor, which means you pursue justice in your nation, and you view the Republican Party as the imperfect vehicle for pursuing civil justice. That's solid advice. The final option, number 4, vote for Donald Trump. I've already acknowledged that Donald Trump is a flawed man. He can be boorish and insufferable. But I'm convinced of this. I believe this man genuinely loves his country and will do everything he can as president to work to make us more prosperous and secure. And that's the key difference, and that's why I plan to vote for Donald Trump. He's the one man with the courage and will to fight this great evil. Now here's the thing. Trump's strengths and virtues are rarely acknowledged. So let me give you 4 reasons to vote for Donald Trump. Number 1, he's got the courage to bring down the system. In other words, the man is a wrecking ball, and I mean that in a good way. If you've ever felt like your government hates you, it's because they do. The swamp doesn't want to get drained, and that's why the D.C. political establishment has opposed him so fiercely. And he's more motivated now than ever to finish the job. He's promised to authorize Elon Musk to streamline government and make it more efficient in a Trump presidency. He's promised to put Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of cleaning up corruption in the health department, because Americans are sicker and fatter than ever. These sound like common sense promises to the American public, but the entrenched powers in Washington, D.C. do not want that to happen. And that's why we need a man with guts. Trump's got it. And this time around, he's got a stronger base of support. 4 years of reflection while he's been wandering in the political wilderness, and the urgency to get it done in the one remaining term he'll have. Second, Donald Trump is honest. His most maddening yet endearing quality is that he speaks his mind. He's not controlled by anyone. He'll tell you what he really thinks if you ask him. Number 3, Trump has made the right enemies. Listen, if you don't have any enemies, then you're not a real leader. This is where Trump's obnoxiousness is actually an asset. It is obvious that Trump is public enemy number 1 of the D.C. political establishment that is entrenched in both parties, both Republican and Democrat. And now he's more motivated than ever to dismantle it. When they had tried to assassinate him in Butler, Pennsylvania back in July, his legacy as a fighter spirit was solidified. That's who this man is. Trump's list of enemies makes me more confident that my analysis is correct. The Democrats, they can have the Romneys, the Cheneys, and the Bushes. They are the problem, not the solution. For crying out loud, the IRS has endorsed Kamala Harris. Think about that. Now, of course, the news media, they hate Trump. Of course they do. They're all owned by media conglomerates that control the flow of information that would hold them accountable. Number 4, Trump will put America first. Democrats are globalists who believe America is a racist nation that doesn't have a right to exist. Have you noticed that they are often on the side of our enemies? We need a real leader that will put America first. A leader that our enemies will fear. I mean, can you imagine Kamala Harris sitting across from President Putin or from the leader of Hamas? They won't respect her. Americans can be bullied into showing respect for an incompetent person since she's a woman of color, but that won't happen with world leaders, especially if they're strong. Donald Trump has been consistent about this since 2016. He wants to make America great again. That's a simple slogan. And America was doing pretty well during his first term. COVID derailed his momentum, but now, 4 years later, you have to wonder if that was all intentional. But in the last 4 years, the American economy, American manufacturing, the American currency, and the American military, they've all suffered. Trump wants to make them great again. Now, the Democrats will say, make America great again as a racist dog whistle. Obviously, that's not true. More blacks and Hispanics are flocking to his side than ever before. They're not falling for that line this time around because they are suffering. So the best thing that could happen in this election, in my opinion, is for Donald Trump to win by such a wide and fraud-proof margin that it sends a clear message to Washington, D.C., and it gives Trump a clear mandate to govern. So let me conclude with these thoughts. I'll read you a text from 1 Timothy chapter 2. It says this: First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. If we're commanded to pray like this, then certainly we should vote like this. A Kamala Harris presidency would seriously hinder our ability to preach the gospel and do the work of Christian ministry. And I care about this for the sake of my family, my church, my community, and for our futures. We should pray and vote that we would live under conditions that give us maximal opportunity to spread the gospel. And that is because Christ himself is the hope of the world. Christianity is a worldview of hope. Jesus Christ is the center of our faith, and Jesus promised the ultimate renewal of all things. And all of this was accomplished because Jesus died, and he was buried, and he rose again with power over death. This hope is as certain as the sun in the sky or as the air in my lungs. My hope does not change from election cycle to election cycle because the hope is anchored in something transcendent and eternal. Jesus Christ is King, and he has all authority. So we should pray and vote that God will be merciful to us and work through a deeply flawed man to sustain conditions of freedom long enough for us to, Lord willing, repent and turn to him. Our hope is not in this election, but this election matters because God does work through these means. So that's my pastoral counsel. Do not vote for the woman who is committed to destroying our nation and our way of life. Rather, vote for a flawed but effective candidate that will resist this destruction so we can live in peace and the hope of the gospel can more freely advance in our society. Thank you for watching. God bless.